Hi Victor, hi Gabriele.
We can start, I think.
Should we start?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So thanks to all of you for being here on this hot Thursday morning, and especially thank you, Lura, for accepting my invitation to take part in our weekly seminar here at the University of Rijeka. Lura is a writer and a researcher based in Pristina. She studied sociology and philosophy at the University of Pristina and New York University, and she also holds a master's degree in cultural studies from the University of Freiburg. Lura's major areas of interest have to do with displacement, identity, youth culture, and feminism. But perhaps the most relevant biographical detail for our talk today is that Lura is one of the authors involved in writing our forthcoming volume, which explores transgender lives, activisms, and culture in the post-Yugoslav space. And Lura's talk today about Kosovo's trans history is based on her chapter in that book, and could also serve perhaps as an occasion for us to engage with some of the broader issues that are related to that collective work. So Lura, thanks again for being with us, and the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you, Boyan. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation. And I want to thank the CAS people and University of Rijeka for hosting me today. I thank you all for persevering and joining another Zoom talk. I know these can be tedious, and I hope that what I present today, which is basically more of a presentation on the research itself than the actual chapter that Boyan mentioned, will be kind of interesting and will at least be a fruitful starter for a conversation about queer historiography in post-Yugoslav space, and obviously in Kosovo in particular. Now, Boyan mentioned a bit about my background. I have really an interdisciplinary background in terms of how I come into research. And I think that was really useful, and particularly in this research, because as some of you might be aware, basically there is no queer history of the Balkans in any way, and even less so in Kosovo. And I feel that critical interventions that have been done in the past were very interesting, because they tackled with kind of the appropriation of human rights discourses and European identity formation by creating these like kind of dichotomy between Muslim identities in Kosovo and Bosnia and the European identity, by analyzing and criticizing kind of this human rights discourse that co-opts LGBTI people and communities for foreign policy interventions and imperialist projects, really. I mean, there are some very interesting previous works done for books that Boyan edited, but also now a new volume by Vjosa Musliu also tackles this kind of problem between LGBTI community in Kosovo, how it's developed as an organizational movement, and the European identity formations, and how European integration is practiced in everyday life. But as a researcher, what I noticed, and I noticed this when I also talked with LGBTI community activists, is that there is no, there is very little documentation and chronicling of queer expression, of queer history, and very little of that has been done in a systematic fashion that kind of brings together this in a narrative, which is something that I'm more interested in as a storyteller, the way that we kind of are introduced to queer histories as separate from each other, as individualized, and as something that don't add up to one narrative and a historiography that would give people a sense of community in a more trans-historical period. And that is to say, not that queer communities and queer individuals are not aware of their history, but that it's often, denied to them and it's not available to them. And this was kind of I came to this realization, and not this realization, but into the problem of kind of origins really in this, because starting to research, I was initially interested in researching or mapping out a turn in the LGBTI movement and activism in Kosovo circa 2015, when we noticed kind of a movement from focusing too much on sexuality and sexual identity into gender, which had previously not been the case. Some of you are more aware about Kosovo, how our constitution written in 2008 is one of the most progressive constitutions in Europe, really, as it actually denotes and protects rights of sexual minorities and guarantees them in the constitution itself. So it's quite a progressive legal framework, so to speak. Naturally, we can discuss how much of it is actually implemented, but the point is, it is like in its outset, the constitution is very progressive, but it never really dealt with gender in the way that we kind of understand it today, right? And so in 2015 or circa 2015, we notice a shift in the LGBTI movement and activism as well, where they start focusing on trans rights and recognition of gender confirmation as a procedure and also as a legal procedure, right? So this is something that happened quite recently. And initially I was interested in this. And then the moment that I started researching this, I realized that what a lot of the things that were being portrayed and depicted as historic firsts were not really such. So there was a history, both legal history and a cultural history that was kind of that preceded these movements and public activism about a legal recognition of trans rights that was simply just not recorded properly, or at least kind of not remembered once the issue became prominent again. And so my research was kind of in a very roundabout way, started from mapping out something in 2015 to turn into more archival research. And as it happens, often by happenstance, and basically as a good researcher, like for a good research to kind of materialize, you have to both have luck and the commitment to do the archival work. And from my previous research into basically newspaper archival research in Kosovo, I wasn't expecting much, but basically what happened is that, and I will tell you the story later a bit, like in completely random, from a random kind of story that I heard from my mother and aunt, I decided to go back to the archives and discovered that there were earlier reportings, and basically found one of what I assume is the earliest reporting, but that obviously can still remains to be confirmed by other researchers, as I only looked at the National Archive in Kosovo, and the earliest reporting of a transgender person in Kosovo, which is dated from 1978. And the chapter focuses a lot on this, and I will talk a bit more about the case of Misin Krasnić later on, because it's interesting to see how it was reported in the 70s and how this is this part of kind of the history of the queer community is completely like it's cut off from the community now. And even the historical accounts that the activists themselves have produced really don't have this kind of, they don't have this connection to that. And this is mostly due to the fact that the Yugoslav wars, and this is perhaps true of all of the post-Yugoslav countries, are also an epistemic kind of break, right? Like we consider everything that happened after the war as a new beginning. And in Kosovo, this new history is often basically written as if from the first. And especially after the Declaration of Independence in 2008, we see a proliferation of these firsts. And so it's not particularly only with regards to queer communities, really, but this is a case in many other sectors. You can be the first in anything in Kosovo nowadays, because the first Kosovar to plant any flag. But the point is that, especially when it comes to queer communities, this is not the case only in Kosovo, this is the case all over the world. And what happens is really that we're erasing queer history by claiming these historic firsts without doing kind of the archival and genealogical work to unearth previous, previous people that existed really in that case. To not like, Boyan knows how much of work was done in this and how much I kind of came about it in a roundabout way. But there are a couple of things that I really found interesting to start off with. And the first was the way that what we know about queer history and the LGBTI movement in Kosovo, but also just in general queer expressions, is very limited. There is a latent fascination with gender bending in Albanian culture. Traditionally, there is a role ascribed to women who take on the social role of men, the sworn virgins. That is a phenomenon that is particular to the highlands of Albania, Kosovo, some parts of Montenegro. And this is not something that is kind of unfamiliar to both scholarly work and travelers and journalists. And I mean, it's every 10 years or so, the New York Times will do a story on the sworn virgins without missing a beat. But there is, nevertheless, that is a limited expression of queerness, if we might even call that, because sworn virgins do not perceive themselves or would not identify as queer, would not identify as transgender, and their community doesn't perceive them as such. But despite this latent fascination, myths about kind of from transitioning from a girl to a boy, we don't really have any kind of like a culture or records of a culture of queerness. And getting into this research was very interesting and difficult at the same time, because a lot of the kind of accounts of LGBTI movement and activism get subsumed into the history of the formal organizations, which is problematic in itself, because activism, and especially civil society activism in the 90s during the segregation of the Albanian population in Kosovo, happened mostly in private homes. So we do need to look at these informal get-togethers to kind of understand how the activism as we understand it today, the LGBTI movement as we understand it today, kind of preceded the 2000s. Essentially, in the 90s, there is records of kind of lesbian organizations that are connected to the organizations in Belgrade. And then from the 2000 onwards, we see formal organizations established that are heavily funded by foreign donors and basically have kind of fought for recognition since basically 2003, have offered social services for LGBTI individuals, and continue to do both the organizing work of kind of public visibility campaigns like the Pride Parade, which just happened last week on the 1st of July, and other kind of legal initiatives. So basically they are kind of the representatives of the community when it comes to the Kosovo institutions. And they are usually included in both like on formal and institutional levels that require the involvement of the community. And nevertheless, this was also very kind of difficult to research, because you have a couple now. There were a few organizations that were established and kind of withered in Kosovo that dealt specifically with LGBTI rights. Currently, there are only 2 that are active. They're part of the Western Balkans networks. This is the Center for Social and Group Development and Center for Equality and Liberty. And they're both very active and like they basically manage drop-in centers, and they do a lot of social services. And only since 2015, as I said earlier, have they started to focus on trans rights in particular. And this is kind of, I believe, it was also a question of demand, because we see that in 2015, 2016, there is an appearance to at least 2 trans activists who are very public, and some of you might know them, Lendi Mustafa and Def Marina, who both of whom have used kind of their own coming out as forms to advocate for either legal recognition of gender or to actually raise awareness about the transition as a process. So we see this kind of incremental and gradual development of the movement, and then kind of the focus shifts a bit circa 2015, and not only by their appearance, but also by what the organizations have produced, which is including, they've produced reports on the state of healthcare for trans individuals in Kosovo. They've also produced basically manuals for psychologists and psychotherapists who are giving treatment to trans individuals. So they've kind of, we see this shift that they've started doing kind of the grunt work in the 2000s, late 2010s, as I don't know how to say that. So yeah, so there has been like a slow and gradual kind of movement formation. And I was kind of interested in that initially. And then I also kind of was interested in how this movement also portrays itself. And there's not a lot of work done in this, but the Center for Equality and Liberty did produce a book, The LGBT Movement, which is far from exhaustive as a publication, where they try to kind of provide a narrative about how the movement developed, the activists that preceded them, but it's technically for them also is very difficult. And so for me, it was also very interesting to see, because this is a new generation of activists who are constantly looking back to find their kind of priors. And for them, it was very difficult to do that because obviously queerness has not been recorded. And there are obviously a lot of things at play there, especially the way that things were recorded in Yugoslavia and what gets recorded in Yugoslavia are very contentious issues, I would say. One thing that I was kind of, I came to, as I said, by accident, was exactly talking to people. I wasn't necessarily interested in this idea of when do trans people appear in Kosovo, because I am taking it for granted that there is a history that we don't really have access to because of the way that history is recorded. And I'm trying to look for destabilizing this idea of the first trans person who comes out, the first trans person who gets legal recognition, because the moment that we look at these things closely, we realize that there were precedents. So for example, in 2019, we have reports of the first recognition of gender change in Kosovo in terms of legal recognition, right? So Blert Marina manages to sue the state and win to his right to change his legal documents, which includes the gender marker, so the name and the gender marker. And what happens here is that we immediately notice, with the moment that this case becomes public, we notice that there were cases before that in this, at least after the war, for sure. There were 2 cases in the same year, and then there were a case previous in 2013. And then when you go even back further, you notice that even during Yugoslav times, there were cases of people changing their gender marker. It's just that we don't have those kind of legal history that is written, right? And so amongst the conversations that I was having, and it was very unclear to me about how these things come about. I was talking to my mother and aunt about my own research, and they mentioned to me that they knew a boy in their neighborhood, in their small town in Western Kosovo, in Peja, who had transitioned in the 70s. And this to me did not seem at all unusual, because these are stories that we've learned to grow up with. However, what was interesting to me was that my aunt was insisting that this was recorded and was actually published in the national daily newspaper, which, by the way, is a very I don't know how to explain Rilinja, because I feel like maybe in Croatia, the newspapers were a bit more liberal, but Rilinja was established in 1945, was the organ of the party, and basically had this very dry style of reporting, and in the sense that it was very much controlled, obviously, like in the 80s, when you have civil unrest and protests in the streets in Pristina and everywhere in Kosovo, like they don't report on this. So this is the kind of newspaper that we're looking at as an archival source. And when my aunt was insisting that this was in the paper, I had to go back to check the papers. So Rilinja is archived it's archived obviously in the Kosovo National Archive, but also in the National Library, and it dates back to 1945. There is limited copies of Rilinja from 1989 onwards, because 89 there were troubles, and then from 91 it wasn't published. But essentially, most of the other issues are available and have been saved. And so I went back to the National Library archives from 1945 to look at these reportings. And initially, Rilinja doesn't have any kind of these. It doesn't really have cultural reporting, or I would say it doesn't even have these magazine style kind of reporting. So I was really skeptic that I would find anything. And then in the 70s, already you see this. You see like a development of these phaeton style, like serialized style exposés. I don't know how to call them in English. It's basically, it's like magazine long form pieces divided into several installments that are supposed to kind of, they function like based on human stories somehow. And there are a lot of stories of these like personal stories of people living, for example, women living as men or women participating in the war, but they were not men. So these are not stories that I looked at as queer expressions, but again, it's very similar to the sworn virgin narrative, where in a certain situation, a woman has to take the role of a man, and then eventually they are found out and marry and have children and babies, and everybody's happy. And then I found in 1978 the story of Misin Krasnić, which then I realized is the same story that my aunt was talking about. And incidentally, this is like it's like an apocryphal story, because one of the other interviews that I made with Lindy, with a trans activist, his mother also mentioned the story, but in a very roundabout way. She mentioned the story saying that, yes, when we were young, we heard of the story, but it's not true. It's a lie. And so it was very interesting to me how this story kind of remains as an urban myth, although it's very documented and obviously publicly available in the public record, and what it means today and how it would, like, how would we analyze it today? And so the story is quite fascinating in and of itself. It's a story of Misin Krasnić, who was, he's a Roma man from Peja who moved to Slovenia and transitioned. I actually found him as well and interviewed him for this chapter, which was actually fascinating because he transitioned in 1978. He had gender confirmation surgery in Ljubljana, and then he detransitioned in 1984. So it was a very interesting kind of story to follow. But for me, it was also, first of all, primarily my primary interest was also in the source itself and the newspaper and how it was written, because it's absolutely jarring to read this article piece in 9 installments, the way that it's written by by a journalist who was part of the public broadcast television and did this story as an exclusive for the Ridinia national newspaper. So first of all, the expose, because we can call it that, is written like a detective story, and it violated, I think, so many ethical standards of journalism that I was initially worried whether I should present this as part of research, because I wasn't sure whether the journalist had the permission of the subject to actually publish this. And obviously there are so many elements here at play, that power play, and you can also imagine that since Misin was not living in Kosovo, there might have been like liberties taken because the journalist didn't care. And I was very concerned about that. And I'll tell you why. And so the fact that I actually got to interview Misin was great, because he then actually gave me a reinterpretation of the story and kind of alternative facts as to what happened. And I think this is also a bit telling of, one, just how gender confirmation was seen in the 70s and how difficult it was actually for him, but also it also explains, or at least destabilizes, this notion of the kind of the story ending really with the kind of the complete transition, which is how the newspaper story goes about. So let me just give you some kind of basic facts. So the story is published in 1978, late 1978. It starts with the journalist kind of going on a hunt for 5 people in Ljubljana who are transitioning. And basically the story is kind of set up as this is the first time that in Yugoslavia, gender confirmation is occurring. And somehow this journalist finds out that one of the patients is from Kosovo, and he goes on to search for this patient and basically completely violates any like privacy rules. He finds her, because this is the other thing, like I think I removed this from the chapter in the end. The journalist basically often refers to Misin either as a he or a she. I referred to Misin obviously as a he because he identifies today as a homosexual man, and throughout the chapter I've kept those pronouns, but the story is actually about Alexandra Krasnich, which is the adopted name of Misin, and the name he took on when he was transitioning and lived as a woman. So the story is from 1978. Krasnich is from Peja. He's moved to Slovenia to work in 1976 and then began his transition there. His identity is discovered by the journalist by going to the security, like the CIA security, the state's security, and discovering it by accident on the table. And basically taking that identity, he goes back to the municipality and tries to find out the name and the address of the person who is transitioning. Journalist also interviews the family, quite like steals pictures from the family, publishes the pictures of Misin as a child, and then goes to Slovenia and goes to Misin's apartment, lies to his landlady that he is his brother, goes into his room without actual permission and steals another picture there, and then asks the landlady to tell Misin, in this case Alexandra, to meet him at a hotel. So at this point, I was like very worried that this was not done with permission, and it actually raises some actual concerns for us as researchers. Should we just republish something like this, even though it is in public record, but it's clear it's a violation to some degree of the subject's privacy and really humanity. And it was quite a dilemma for me ethically at this point, whether this is something that you can just regurgitate, because essentially this person is obviously still alive, and since his name and his family members are all published here, it would be easy to track him and them, really. But I talked to Misin afterwards when I found out he lives now in Austria, and we had an interview. We had a couple of interviews actually, and I talked to him about this, and apparently he did give the journalist permission, but he promised him to be paid, which he never was. So this is kind of like why the story itself is very interesting, because basically, first of all, it introduces new terminology in Albanian about transgender. It actually, because of this dichotomy in Albanian and the way that we use gender and sex interchangeably, it actually creates a new term that is literally transgender, which we don't use today anymore, gjenindërimi. And then it's also kind of, it introduces the Albanian public in Kosovo to the concept of gender confirmation surgery as something, as basically as a novelty, but also an achievement of Yugoslav medicine, right? So this is a positive achievement. And it also, it delves really deeply into kind of the intricacies of transition, including the surgery and the hormones and how much the hormones cost at the time. And, but it also attempts to do something that is kind of preemptive in a way. The story already reports that Alexandra, or rather Misin Krasnich, has had a successful gender confirmation surgery, is now a woman, and is going to get married to a doctor. And basically, we have this happy ending leitmotif, which is found quite often in LGBT stories, the way that they're kind of narrativized in mass media. And basically, it also it puts a spin to her story that is it puts the spin to the Alexandra story that is just really kind of definite, you know. And there are some very interesting liberties that the journalist took that I found important to discuss with Misin himself. First of all, he publishes, as I said, photos that were stolen. He publishes photos of Misin at the time that he was presenting as a woman. He publishes Misin's ID, the new ID, which he got, and he basically explains also the process of the legal gender change back in Kosovo, which is why I mentioned earlier, like the moment that we look at these historic firsts, like you immediately see that there's bigger things, and like if you dig deeper, we have there are kind of probably an unlimited number of cases like this that occurred earlier on. And another thing that is probably very telling for the story is basically the way that the article also provides kind of medical insight, because it also publishes parts of the Misin's diagnosis as a transgender person. And it is both kind of this melodramatic expose, and at the same time like a happy ending story of someone who has transitioned successfully, has had a successful gender confirmation surgery, and now lives happily ever after in Slovenia as a woman. Except that, of course, this was not the case. And when I talked to Misin, this was kind of the most interesting part of this research, actually, because we went back together through the article to see what was kind of retold. And first of all, now as Misin tells his story, is that he was actually kind of probably misdiagnosed as transgender. He was kind of on the fence about this because he was aware that his family also were perceived him as a girl when he was younger, and were like more accepting of him as a trans woman rather than they are now as a homosexual man. And that he was always basically, you go back to this kind of psychoanalysis really, he goes back to his psychoanalyzing his perceptions at the time. And basically there's a lot of things to unpack, both in the article and in the interview that I had with Misin, conflating these sexual desires with gender identity, which were very difficult to parse, and also very telling of the differentiation that has happened since then for us as not only as researchers, but also for the trans community itself. The language has changed, and Misin is, since he is older, the language is very different. So this was also another kind of layer that was very difficult to kind of uncouple when I was discussing with him. So for example, when I was talking to Misin, he was telling me that he was first introduced to this idea, like he first learned about gender confirmation surgery when he was recovering from a different disease in Slovenia. So he went to Slovenia to work, right? He had finished commercial high school, which is like professional high school in Peja, and then moved to Slovenia to work and live there. And so he learned about this possibility from a woman who was also a patient, and a magazine article in Germany about a man who had transitioned to a woman. And Mr. was 22 when he was diagnosed, and he was diagnosed obviously by a psychiatrist, and some of them are quoted in the article that Marina published, so in the article in Read India, and basically they present their own work as something that is humane and liberating people from suffering, essentially. And this is something that the article doesn't dispute, which is very interesting to me, because you already see this belief in science and medicine as kind of the ultimate arbiter, right? And also, like as I said earlier, but what happens next, right? So we leave in the article, we leave Alexandra / Misin, we leave her happily transitioned and getting ready to marry. And I wanted to learn what happened really before and afterwards. And so initially what Misin told me in my first interview is that the story was actually kind of a lie, that he had not transitioned at that point completely, that he had just started his transition and was on hormone therapy, but had not had gender confirmation surgery yet. And that he was seeing a trans man who was a doctor at the hospital, but then that later they broke up after Misin had his gender confirmation surgery. Misin himself considers himself to be the first case of the first patient of a gender confirmation surgery in Slovenia. He was operated by Dr. Jože Lokar, which I realize now appears in other cases as well from Yugoslavia. and he quite remembers quite well that period. And then it becomes really difficult to understand what has happened next, because it seems that after his transition, actually, he was actually struggling a lot, both to find and keep jobs, and was struggling with his hormonal therapy. And essentially, it's not clear when, but first of all, he eventually moved to Switzerland and then started working as a sex worker and an exotic dancer. And then basically at some point in 1984, he says he had a psychotic breakdown and detransitioned. So he explains this period in his life as basically accepting that he had gender confirmation surgery and that he was a woman, but that he didn't feel like one. And then that he basically eventually stopped taking any hormones and started dressing again as presenting as a man. So there are so many layers to the interview and the paper. Some of the notions that I really like, some of the things that kind of stood out for me is things that I've already kind of mentioned, is that first of all, there was the possibility at the time to undergo this treatment, despite the limited success if we look at the case of Misin. And then there was interest, and there was also actual public presentation of such a case. And that basically, even in the way that it was presented, despite kind of the passive aggressiveness and the intrusiveness of the journalist in the story, there is still some kind of understanding of this as a medical procedure, and an understanding and a kind of an expression of basically of the procedure as valid in and of itself, as reconfirming the kind of the gender identity, kind of inherent gender identity. So this was kind of interesting. What then becomes more obvious from the interview is that one, like there is no such thing as kind of this finite happy ending really for anyone, and in particular not in the cases that we like. The transition, first of all, should not be seen definitely as something that ends with gender confirmation, obviously, but that it also, the story itself is kind of imbued with context that we cannot reach at simply by reading the media journalistic accounts, because there's so much that is left out. And what is left out is actually the context in which, despite this being available as a procedure, it has limited success because of the social circle and acceptance, which we notice, which is obvious from the interview with Misin that I did afterwards, was not essentially not available then as it is not now. And what was really interesting for me was to talk a bit more about, so obviously the detransitioning part is very complicated, and I didn't want to get into psychoanalyzing the case, because first of all, it's not my area of expertise, and really it would be just probably inappropriate in that sense. But for me, it was very interesting to see how this permission itself, it changed gradually. There was a shift in not only how he perceived himself, but also how he experienced this transition and how it was presented. So whereas in the newspaper, we have a presentation that Misin as Alexandra is works, kind of is like almost an well-integrated member of society. In the interview, this kind of falls apart, because Misin was telling me about being kind of stalked, of being let go from multiple jobs, and from having problems actually staying in one place because people were offensive towards him, and then that it wasn't really easy. And then there are also layers to his experience as a trans woman in particular, which is he also had to deal with misogyny and sexism, and especially in the past 10 years, he was saying that even though he didn't identify as a woman, but as basically as a man who was a transsexual woman, he was also experiencing a lot of discrimination as a woman. And this was one of the things that kind of made him like basically throw out all of his womanly clothes and present exclusively as a man. So this was, so my research kind of is very raw in that sense. So what I've actually done for this chapter is that I've kind of, I've tried to go back further in the archives to see if there were previous media recordings and chronicles of transgender people in Kosovo before 2014 and 13, when we see the first kind of media reports about trans people that are from Kosovo but that live abroad. And then obviously this was, luckily this did actually happen, and I'm kind of glad that this was recorded. And the second of all was to actually find the person who had given their story in the 70s and who had published their story, to see what, like how that context has changed, how this person actually reinterprets that period. And basically I think it's very difficult to draw any definite conclusions from this research, except that one, it is really important for us to do more archival research into queer history, and that is absolutely possible to discover more. And at the same time, this is just, I think, the beginning of understanding kind of the differences that we notice in the way that trans people were treated in Yugoslavia and are treated now. So not like this is just like only halfway through what I wanted to say, but I also realized that I've been talking for 45 minutes and I don't want to take longer time. There are so many details of the story that I couldn't even kind of scratch the surface. But to me, it was fascinating to find and to have the ability to have an interview with such openness with someone who had undergone transition and detransition so long ago in a way, and to basically see how this kind of, not to see, but just to kind of map out, or at least to record slowly, how these discursively, how things have changed, like just on a level of language and perception. And because when you talk to current activists, I mean, Misin is not and wasn't a trans activist ever. And he doesn't even, I don't think he is part of any kind of active trans community. He lives in outside of Graz. He's in therapy. So he was diagnosed with a psychosis in 1984, and he still is in therapy. So there are also ethical elements to this interview as well, right? To what degree do we have the right as researchers to impinge on someone's vulnerability and just generosity of time and story when they are also in a difficult medical situation, really. And what is telling is also basically how, like, there was a shift, there is a generational shift, and that it's very difficult to kind of conflate, or it actually kind of makes it also impossible to create these kind of lineages directly, because these are kind of stories that are there and have been kind of coexistent individually and separately and have not been connected, and that basically exist separately. And what for us is there to be done is essentially to just kind of record them and to try to understand more a bit about our own kind of social context and social history as to what has happened in Yugoslavia and how that connects to how we deal with these issues today. So there's that legacy, absolutely, and that legacy is connected, like legally at least, as in most other post-Yugoslav places. Kosovo also inherited a lot of the legal framework that we had in Yugoslavia. So there's a lot of those kind of linkages for sure. And then absolutely there are social, basically, and cultural linkages, the way that our kind of the family structures and the social structures have dealt with queer people and queerness. And this is both kind of telling of how much is out there and we haven't done that work. And it's also telling of how we need to do that work. So I'm not gonna continue much longer. The other part of research was mostly focused on recent activism and actually recent public basically coming out of trans people. And the reason why I also focus mostly on the public aspect of this is because that even though these are very public and these are very recorded and they're in the public record, it seems that every time we kind of publish something about queer people, be that in the media or as scholars, we have this tendency to kind of not mention things, and that for me is very problematic, and that's something that we should kind of look at. And I also didn't want, and I don't think that's it wasn't really part of this research as well, to kind of prove the existence of trans individuals prior to the 2000s, but it was to basically prove that not only they existed, but they were also recorded, and we still pretend that they were not. Okay, thank you for listening to me. I'm sorry that this was a bit all over the place. It's just that there's so much material and that I wanted to share, and I'll stop here.
Wow, thank you so much, Lura. This was incredibly rich, and I think I told you at one point that one could write a PhD thesis or a whole book on the basis of this particular case. I mean, there are so many layers, and I guess it's very challenging for you to juggle all these dimensions. You know, like there is a Romani person from Kosovo traveling to Slovenia. Then there is like a history of psychiatry. There is gender, nation, race, sexuality, all in one place. So thanks a lot. Are there any questions, comments? We are also joined by Maya Pan, who is another author of the volume. Hi, Maya.
I think Victor has a question.
Yes, Victor.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And what immediately came to my mind is this is more of a comment than a question, that Pajtim Statovic, who might be one of the most famous Kosovar authors discussing gender issues, and I know that his second novel was nominated for the National Book Prize, and it's very interesting how he's using the experience of migration and being a migrant and a transition also within body. So that's very exciting to me. And maybe I have a question after all. And so that led to me to think that I don't know the exact numbers, but I think almost 1 million Kosovar Albanians are living abroad as a result of the war. And I was wondering, have you researched, or do you think you will research, or has anyone researched perhaps the interconnections of the communities outside of Kosovo and the people living in Kosovo? And I know that Kosovar Albanians are often mixed with Albanians living abroad, and so there is that connotation to that. And yeah, so I was wondering if there is any information about the dynamics back and forth.
There are some, I feel like there are some studies about diaspora, like there are studies like in diaspora studies about like social cohesion. There's been done, like there's a book on Albanian mafia, which is tells you a lot about our organization. I haven't read it, but I'm sure that I would hate it. But I mean, there's studies about kind of the social organization of Albanians abroad. But absolutely no, there hasn't been something about like queer community and how they're connected to diaspora. That is absolutely something that happens. For example, there's like a clear connection between queer activists in Kosovo and queer Albanians who live abroad. They are involved, they were involved. There's a lot of people who migrated because of, especially because of discrimination and stigma due to sexual orientation. And I mean, the people that I myself talk to, like Sojendi and JFT, amongst them, they were both at some point like about to leave Kosovo. They just didn't want to live here. And so I think it's really like, it's, yes, absolutely, a lot of Kosovo Albanians, like, I mean, I guess from Kosovo, Albanians probably like less than 1 million live abroad, but yeah, like a lot of people live abroad. But a lot of the people who left exactly initially because of economic segregation in the 90s and then the war. And now the youth are leaving obviously due to like lack of opportunities, but also because of the stigma and the difficulty of living in what is quite a traditional and closed off society. Like, despite, I don't want to assert that this is somehow a kind of static society that hasn't at all progressed or anything like that, but it absolutely is very stigmatizing and not so tolerant, despite the very progressive legal framework that I mentioned. So I don't know any of the studies in particular about this, but absolutely there are linkages to be made, and somebody should make them. I haven't read Pajtim's second book. I've only read the first one, My Cat Yugoslavia. And yeah, it's absolutely interesting what he is doing with migration. For me, it's also very interesting linguistically because he writes this in Finnish and it's been translated in English, but he has refused to translate the books in Albanian so far. So it's quite interesting. And he's not the first to do this. There were previous cases of Albanian authors who wrote in French or Italian and didn't want to republish in Albanian. But it's quite interesting and telling to me how maybe hostile he perceives this this context. So yeah, thank you so much. Yes.
Hi, sorry, I came late. I had some another Zoom, so maybe you already mentioned that. I would only, I mean, that's a very important topic. I'm involved in it in a different way, promoting queer literature in Croatia in translation. I'm more involved than some of you who have me on Facebook with the issue in Argentina. I would only like to share this information and ask you, maybe you already mentioned it, but I came late. I've watched the recorded lecture. So Argentina recently adopted a transgender quota for public sector jobs. So 1% of all public sector jobs are reserved for transgender people. But what worried me in this context, and I think that that's a global problem, is that 7% of people of transgender people in Argentina had formal jobs, and 70% of them were condemned to prostitution, and the average life expectancy is 36 years. So this is one thing that, apart from, as I could see from what I heard from you, this persecution of them in different ways. What is the situation in Kosovo or in general in the Balkans, if you know that?
Yeah, I don't have any data on this. Like, there's obviously very little data on this. I can tell you that in Kosovo, it's so gendered, the difference between stigmatization. And this is the reason why we have 2 trans men activists who are very public, because it's absolutely more acceptable to be a trans man than a trans woman. And we have similar issues, absolutely, except that we don't have any kind of progressive, at least in Kosovo, there's absolutely no kind of quota. We do have a gender quota, but that does not in any way affect trans people, like not explicitly. So we have like a gender quota for the public leadership, which should be 50-50 for women and men. And then this does not really at all kind of address the problem with sexual minorities or other gender minorities. So basically, there is no data from Kosovo. I can tell you that. It's not something that is even collected by our agency of statistics, to be honest. All the data we have really are like public polls that were done by like third parties or international organizations. There's not a clear number that I could give you. And I'm not sure whether Bojan could tell you more about like the context overall in Balkans or not, because I'm not that familiar with the overall situation.
Thank you.
Well, yes, certainly homelessness and unemployment are something that follow trans people also in the region. But what I wanted to go back to, Lura, is this idea that in spite of all my efforts to avoid this, it looks like we ended up as a group of cis people discussing trans history. And and the status of trans people in the region. And I wanted to see with you how you struggled with this issue over the last 2 years. What did it mean for you to be a cis author writing about trans? Because I am a little bit sorry that none of our, like, at least 10 trans authors who are in the volume have joined us today. And I don't think that's completely accidental or has to do with people not having time, but it might reflect some of the tensions that we have in the volume, and some of the dilemmas that many trans authors who have joined us have about, you know, cis people also being there, writing or supporting them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned a lot of ethical dilemmas about writing and including the part of the research that I did, but I didn't mention my original ethical dilemma, which is exactly who am I to be representing or producing knowledge about trans people at all? And the only kind of the only excuse there is basically not excuse, but kind of the rationalization that I went through as an author is actually assessing the damage that is being done or the benefit of producing such knowledge or not producing it at all. And one of the things that I have to say is cis people, as a cis person, as cis people, when we produce knowledge, if we decide to not produce something because it does not, first of all, there should be absolutely any attempt at not taking opportunities, which, as Boyan knows, this paper was initially attempted to be co-written with the two people I interviewed, and both of them, one of them at least, was very, very frank and honest with me and had issues about this, and basically told me that it will be very difficult for me to interview trans people right now in Kosovo because exactly they are extremely exhausted of being kind of hijacked for projects that other people are doing. And obviously, writing an academic paper and having, which, as all of you know, does not pay and will never pay, is very different from having an art project or like a civil society project where there's like clear, tangible results and deliverables that you give to your donor. But this is a difference that gets lost on people who just are fed up of being represented, and I do totally get that, and that tension is valid. But what would be then harmful for me, however, is if I, who had the time to do this research and the curiosity, would have said, no, I'm not doing this because it does not belong to me to do it. And then further on, we just ignore this continuously. And then there's no knowledge produced, even if it is basically an incremental addition to the literature that exists. So for me, the rationalization was thinking, was I doing harm or was I doing good? And whether that, was I being ethical in the way that I'm approaching the topic? Am I taking in my own privilege as a cis woman? Am I thinking about the issue that is at hand? And while it does not belong to me, as I said, to psychoanalyze my subjects, and it does not belong to me to kind of reduce their experience and their lives to something or the other, it is important, perhaps for me as a researcher, to go back and actually criticize what has been done and how trans narratives have been portrayed, which I feel like this chapter is what it does. Like, first of all, it kind of aggressively addresses how trans narratives are portrayed in media and mass media, and basically it's also a critical intervention there, because otherwise we would just consider them that this is how they should be, right? So my background is also journalism and editing. So for me, that is also very important on a personal level, the way that journalism kind of gets built up and how we create these like narratives that are then repeated and they reinforce each other. So for me, in terms of media studies, that is also a critical intervention in my own field, right? So absolutely, I do understand that there is a tension here. I don't know how it can be solved in this particular case. The problem with the case of Kosovo in particular was that there are actually at the moment no trans academics working in this area. And what would have happened basically is just that this paper would not have been produced, which might not be a great loss to scholarship on the grand scheme of things, but it would be, I think, a loss in for the other intervention, which is kind of my personal life goal, which is the occlusion and exclusion of Kosovo from all post-Yugoslav projects, which is a whole different aspect. So yeah, I do not really have an answer. I do understand that trans people don't want to hear me talk about their experiences, and I totally get that. But I also get that I want to kind of deal with the journalists and other people who have written about trans people and I think are problematic and are not being kind of either addressed or like recorded. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Maya?
Oops, yes. Lura, nice meeting you. I'm very happy to meet you in, well, this way.
Person.
I will listen to recording of your lecture. I couldn't attend it as well on time for other work. This dilemma that you are mentioning now about where to write from, which position, and how it's exactly the same dilemma I had as a cis woman. My first reflex was to go and to decline the invitation to participate in trans volume. I participated in lesbian volume, and there it was kind of, clear. Yes, as a lesbian, as a feminist, this book is your place. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned rationalization, and yes, I think we do go through some rationalization. The way how I went around this was to say, okay, I'm writing from this perspective, but what is valuable that I can offer is from my perspective, relation towards lesbian feminism, towards trans feminism, for example. So I had to establish in myself this rational connection. What comes next then, of course, is that, will my writing now be understood as a tokenized thing, for, am I now here to answer all the turfism? Because I was personally also very motivated to write on behalf of that, but not, my intention was not like, let's now, discuss this turfism. I'm so not interested in it. So I decided for the specter of solidarity. Mm-hmm. So to have a way more constructive approach initially, and to problematize not this particular, incidents, moments, who said what, who accused what, who, excluded whom, or I wanted to go beyond that and rather, approach more theoretically. So what is in lesbian or queer feminism that can be used as the solidarity base, or, and to add just another comment to what you were saying, because I think it relates. So in these few interviews that I made with activists, whom predominantly they were cis lesbians, feminists, it came out exactly the moment of solidarity, which activists, they were in, so activists from lesbian organization Rijeka are in, let's say, niche, and they're holding a banner, trans women are our sisters. So you see, there are a few layers there. And when I ask an activist, how, tell me about this. So the explanation, or not, what she said was, I see the situation with trans women now very similarly to as we had it with lesbians, I don't know, years ago. For example, I see that they are as sexualized as we were as homosexuals, or in particular lesbians, first invisibilized and then combined with this. So she saw clear relation in that respect. And also she saw a relation with womanhood, with being a woman, with women's identity, in respect of, yes, it's like, you know, you beat women long enough until, you know, they can't speak anymore for themselves. There needs to be generations and generations of, you know, women activists who can stand on their own to finally be able to have a trans woman there standing with such banner, for example. So she understood this as her responsibility for the time that is coming. So this is her contribution, standing there, because we can't have trans women at the time being standing there in niche with such banner. So this is what I got from the interview. And of course, as an activist myself, I think I can very well intrinsically understand what is there, but doesn't make things any less complicated or any,
Yeah.
you know.
I mean, but yeah, but this is also kind of the question of representation. Like, do we want to essentialize identities to that extent that none of us can talk about anything else except our own personal experiences? And that for me is, I don't know, it's complex. I don't, like, I do get that. I do get that. But I do get that the point is that you should not, like, there are moments that you should be kind of, how do you call that? You should basically amplify with your platform other people and not take up that space. And maybe, I mean, this, I hope that it's not the chapter is doing damage in that sense, you know what I mean? Like, I hope that by actually talking about a topic, you actually make the topic more important and you amplify the people within it. And also there are two ways about writing about things, and I obviously try to not write about my subjects as like objects, and that is what I found, like, kind of how I solve my ethical dilemmas there. They're like kind of subjects in their own right within the article as well, which I feel a lot of like earlier literature about trans lives doesn't do, you know, like, I mean, like, especially again, like there's even like trans studies is not a very, like, it's not very old. So you see even within the literature, this shift, right? So I was trying not to do those, that kind of epistemic violence in some sense. So these are absolutely things that are constantly being negotiated and renegotiated as you write along and as you do this kind of work. But I find that it would be more violent if we simply ignored this part of history just because there is not a trans or queer academic doing this work right now, in which I hope there will be, absolutely. And this is why I constantly say that this is just like the beginning of a research that can be done, but it's much easier, I guess, for the next person if they have something to go by, perhaps. I don't know. Again, as I said, this is more like rationalizing and then dealing with a complex fact that I also have this. And as you said, like as a feminist, like, do you want to deal with all the turfism? Like, is this my burden to carry? Like, do I now need to explain turfs, or do I need to justify that I'm not one or something like that? So it's a very complex web, and it's also a complex web of finding out how it is to be the best ally and what is the best way to be an ally in each situation. And I think in the Kosovo situation, allyship would mean to actually contribute your time to do the work that somebody else is not doing, but that is needed to be done, and to start that work and to push that. And I mean, I do hope that having things like this written down will encourage more people to do the kind of work that is academic and basically is kind of more but just the knowledge production, really, because I don't see myself as a queer scholar, not at all, and I don't think that this is something that I'm intending to portray myself as, but that it will kind of be like a starting point for the next generation of queer scholars or trans scholars, because there literally are just a few articles out there right now about Kosovo and queerness.
Anyone else? I just wanted to say that I liked a lot what you said about the Yugoslav wars as also being epistemic breaks, which were, of course, breaks that followed ethnic lines or national lines. And now we are dealing within this volume with another epistemic break, if you want, and it is this cis-trans epistemic break. And the thing is that along any of these breaks, there is a huge potential for knowledge loss. Because I think that what the Yugoslav wars were really a lot about is this incredible cognitive impoverishment. And not only was there a lot of feminist knowledge lost, but also the whole framework, you know, which we use to produce knowledge has been changed. And speaking about this epistemic breaks, I remembered Roger Brubaker and his idea of epistemic insiderism, you know, how difficult and potentially dangerous it might be for us to be completely closed within our national or identity communities. And this is really what we are trying a little bit to problematize and to resist with the volume on many scales. That's why I think an edited volume like a collective work is very good for us in the Yugoslav space, because it resists this force of this very centrifugal force, you know, this force of dispersion, and it brings us together a little bit, at least in a book, you know. And very often in LGBT circles, there is this question, what is a community? And I often say, you know, our book is a community. This is where we come together, you know, like a community is generated through writing. And it's very sad for me then to see that we could be a little bit locked in this loop of identity, which is not only here cis-trans, but it can also be, and that is quite relevant, activist academic. You know, maybe many people have not really joined us because they consider this to be somehow too academic. But if we are trying to problematize gender binaries, why wouldn't we then problematize academic activist binary? And this is what we are also trying to do a little bit in the volume. And thanks for contributing to that.
Thank you. No, I mean, it's a valid question, and it's something that we constantly have to grapple with, I think, all of us, basically.
Any other questions, interventions?
I guess no, but I really wanted to thank all of you for joining me this morning. It's probably very warm outside and nicer to be outside than on Zoom, but I'm very happy that you managed to come and listen. And I really hope that soon it will also be out there and shared widely as a paper as well.
Yeah, so we hope to finish the volume by October, so it should be published at some point next year. So Marco Luca, Sanja, should we then call it a day?
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and I really hope we'll be able to meet in Rijeka or in Cres soon, and maybe even sort of promote the volume.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
This would be a great idea, actually. Yeah. Thank you very much, Lura, and thank you very much, Bojan.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you soon. Ciao.
Extraordinary. Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.